So when we look at the week 1 assignment, let us just basically start there. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you. Okay, so the week 1 assignment, historical context of the Gospels. So it basically states, after reading the course material for this week, create a 12 to 15 slide PowerPoint presentation on how your understanding of the Gospels is impacted by the following bolded elements. So before we get into these bolded elements, I just want to go over just some general things that will perhaps be helpful. So you see where it states to create a 12 to 15 slide PowerPoint presentation. Okay, so if you would just cover each section that is called for in the assignment instructions, that will give you at least 10 to 12 slides. If you take one slide per area, that would give you at least 10 to 12 slides. But overall, depending on the amount of content that you incorporate into your presentation, your slide presentation can easily be more than 12 to 15 slides. So just giving you a basic overview of how to essentially lay out your PowerPoint presentation. So for example, the cover slide and the reference slide, they do not count within this presentation slide count itself. Those two do not count. The cover slide and the actual reference page slide or reference slide itself does not count. We're looking at content. So for example, if you have 4 slides as it relates to the historical and political context, Persians, Greeks, Maccabees, and Romans, that would be 4 slides. But once again, if your content, depending on the depth of your content, it could easily be more than 4 slides that will cover these particular areas. And then also when you look at the religious elements, Jewish beliefs, the temple, priesthood, synagogue groups within Judaism, and the study of the Torah, you have here 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, at least 7, 8, or easily more than 8 slides that could be generated based upon what is being called for as relates to religious elements, and then also your social and cultural elements of daily life in Jesus' time. So I want to give you some information now that will be helpful to being able to research these particular entities that are called for in the assignment instructions. So if you would look at chapter 4 in your textbook entitled 4 Portraits, One Jesus, if you do not have your textbook for the course, please do send me an email and let me know. And then also don't forget to notify student services as soon as possible if by this time you do not have your textbook for this course. And so chapter 4, it covers the political and historical context of these groups that you see mentioned here, Persians, Greeks, Maccabees, and Romans. And then in chapter 5 covers the religious elements or components. Let me go back to chapter 4. That begins on page 119 in your textbook. And then when you look at chapter 5, let me just try to get to it real quick. Chapter 5 begins on page 157. So chapter 4 begins on page 119. Chapter 5 begins on page 157. And then chapter 6 begins on page 189. So looking at religious elements, once again, you have Jewish beliefs, you have the temple. But when you get into these particular things, then you have subcategories. So once again, there's a lot of content available in the reading alone. And so there shouldn't be any challenge at all in having the content that is needed to be able to adequately fulfill the requirements of the assignment. So under core Jewish beliefs, you have things like monotheism, which means basically belief in one God. You have the covenant, Israel as God's chosen people, or the law, the Torah as well. And then when you get into the temple and the priesthood, you have subcategories one temple for the one true God. And then you have the Levites and the priests and the high priest. And so once again, the text is filled, is packed with a lot of great content that would assist in fulfilling the requirements of the assignment. And once again, if you do have any questions as it relates to any of these things, please feel free to give me a call or send me an email. Another thing that I want to touch on as well, when you read over and beyond these areas, specifically when you start looking at different people groups within Judaism, there are several people groups, and seem like there's a tendency to cover some of the main groups like the Essenes and Sadducees and Pharisees. But also when you look at page 173 in the text, there are other people groups that are mentioned. You have the Zealots, group referred to as social bandits, and other revolutionaries. And then you have Herodians and people of the land. And so once again, if you would take a look at that, and then when you get into chapter 6 that addresses the social and cultural settings of the gospel, this is some very good information for you to take a look at and read. It'll give you a great understanding of the background of the gospels. That's the gospels, and so you can be aware. For those who may not be aware, it really addresses the birth, the life, the death, resurrection of Jesus Christ. It tells the story. These books tell the story of the life of Christ. It covers his teaching, his miracles, some of his sayings. And so once again, I would like to encourage you as well to read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. You'll see call outs for readings as well in your reading assignment. And so take a look at that. I want to touch on this regarding each gospel, each book of the gospel, just to kind of give you just a broad overview of what are the gospels. Basically, the gospel term itself is a Greek term that essentially means good news. So as it relates to the scripture, it refers to the good news of Christ. And once again, it tells the story of his birth, his life, his death, and his resurrection. Each gospel, we have 4 gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Each of them basically tells the story of Christ from various perspectives. Matthew, he himself was a disciple of Christ, but he was also by profession a Jewish tax collector, and he writes the Gospel of Matthew. Then you look at the Gospel of Mark, you look at the Gospel of Luke, and then you have the Gospel of John. Mark was not a disciple. Mark was a companion of the Apostle Paul. He writes the Gospel of Mark. When he writes, actually, he writes to a Greek audience. Then you have Luke. Luke was not a disciple. Luke was a physician by trade. He was also a companion of Paul. Luke writes the Gospel of Luke, and then he also writes the book of Acts. When you look at the first chapter of the Gospel of Luke and then look at the first chapter of the Gospel of Acts, Acts is actually the sequel to the Gospel of Luke. So you find in the Gospel of Luke all that happens during the life of Christ, but then in the book of Acts, you find recordings of what took place after Christ ascended to heaven. And then you have the Gospel of John written by John the Apostle. And so that's just a general overview of the Gospels themselves. I would encourage you to take the opportunity to read those particular books of the Bible. They will be very helpful as you work through your assignments, particularly even like in this first week when you start looking at the temptation of Christ. Another thing that I want to touch on is just a few other things as it relates to the PowerPoint presentation. Keep in mind the requirements of the assignment, especially when it relates to speaker notes. Some may not be familiar with how to incorporate speaker notes. It says all slides and speaker notes are to be in APA format. I took clinical pastoral education courses and I had to do a PowerPoint presentation. And so I'm going to just share my screen to show this PowerPoint presentation so you can see what speaker notes look like. So if you would just bear with me a second or two. So when you look here at the bottom of this presentation, you see where it says chapter 8 is pointing basically toward the chapter that I covered. But these are speaker notes down at the bottom of the presentation. Many have the tendency to put all their notes as relates to the presentation within the body of the slide itself. Those are not speaker notes. Those are just basically comments, notations. You see how I have comments, notations, and page numbers listed here on the presentation itself within the slide itself. And then also you see here where at the bottom, then I go into the narrative. I have page numbers where I've given credit to my source that was used here. And so you see how that's laid out with, direct quotes are enclosed in quotation marks with references to page numbers. And so once again, you want to actually make sure that you have your slides listed in APA format. And so once again, these are speaker notes. If you have any problems or trying to look at how to incorporate speaker notes, if you look at the very, very bottom here, you see where it says notes, okay? When I clicked on that, you see where the notes went away. And when you click on it again, you see where the notes appear, and you can go in, and I'm just going to make just a few notations here. You see where I've typed in there. And so that's basically how you incorporate speaker notes into your slide presentation.